Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast. And as I mentioned in my last video, in this Asian horror playlist, we've reached a point where some addendums are in order. So I have seen a bunch of Asian horror movies after I reviewed those years in this playlist. So I thought it would be a good idea to cover some of those movies that I missed the first time around. And also note that two of the films that we're discussing this evening are films that I have seen before, but I'm covering them again because I changed my assessment after a recent rewatch. So let's get started here. I've got 10 mini reviews for you tonight, and as always, titles for all of the movies I discuss will be listed in the description box below. Now the first title this evening is in fact a rewatch, and that is The Unborn, 2003 from Thailand. While staying in a hospital, a woman sees strange things while recovering from an assault that almost drowned her. She also finds out early on that she is 10 weeks pregnant. Are these visions simply psychological hallucinations, or is there really a supernatural threat at work here? Now, I mentioned before that this is one of those movies that is a bit of a mixed bag, but I tend to rewatch it once in a while because I remember it being decent, and here we are. I'm officially upgrading it to a pass grade now. So early on, our protagonist is dealing with a physically abusive man who uses her to sell drugs. And that does create an edgy, dramatic element right near the beginning. And there are also a few discussions about abortion early on. Now, the plot eventually morphs into a rather cliche premise, even if we're considering that this was made in 2003, because we get an investigation element into the ghost's past, stuff like that. Very common for Asian horror films. Also, the ending is a little bit on the lame side, and I've always had this criticism of this movie, and that still kind of stands. One of the weaker moments of the movie is like the finale. But thankfully, the pacing is fairly good throughout. The actress from Nang Nak is the lead here. If you've seen that Thai horror movie, she returns here in this separate storyline. And that's one reason that maybe you'd like to watch this. This movie does have atmosphere, though, and that's what I enjoy most about it. I think it's its greatest strength. You know, the opening credits have like a green color scheme with some images that you can't entirely make out. The hospital environment creates some atmosphere, especially during the opening half. There's a very specific feel that a hospital gives off. It's very like sickly, yet deceptively white and clean at the same time. And because of this, there's some people that actually really like horror movies that are set in hospitals. It's a very specific type of environment. So here's another one to add to the hospital horror subgenre, I guess you could call it. There are a lot of like water-based visuals, fetus-based horror imagery as well that works quite well. The scare scene in the bathroom involving water is a pretty interesting idea. Now there are some ghost girls here, which is cliche, but the frequency of the scares does help to compensate. So I think if you're into like the Thai horror scene from the 2000s and you have not checked out The Unborn, I do moderately recommend it now. It's not a classic or anything to me, but it's certainly watchable. And this movie is currently available on a DVD box set. It's called Nightmares from Asia from Tokyo Shock. That came out years ago, but it's still available and fairly cheap online. Next, our next film this evening is a micro-budget flick that is not worth watching. I'm just going to tell you right off the bat. However, the concept is noteworthy, and it's the only film for which I have done a feature-length commentary. A few years ago, I was a guest on the Artie Dan's YouTube channel, and we watched this movie live, along with a few other gentlemen who showed up to watch it with us. And it was quite fun. And I will include a link to that video in the description box below. But the movie we watched has one of the greatest titles for any Asian horror film ever conceived. And that is Game of Thrones presents Dead Space, 2016 from China. And yes, that is the actual title of the film. A little bit of a marketing ploy there for sure, because it has nothing to do with either one of those properties. But the film opens with a creepy dude who murders someone in a forest. Some old-timers attack him and burn his evil lair down. 18 years later, a group of friends die in a nightmare, one by one. They attempt to defeat the villain, but can they stay awake long enough to solve the mystery? Now, if you haven't guessed it yet, this is a Chinese ripoff of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Yes. More specifically, this is a ripoff of the crappy American remake from 2010. Now, the story is practically a duplicate copy of the 2010 remake for much of the runtime. Needless to say, this is a pretty bad movie, very low budget, as I mentioned. Not a problem in and of itself. I've reviewed a bunch of micro-budget gems on this channel over the years. In fact, I'm reviewing one later in this video that's actually pretty good. But Dead Space does not cut it, folks. It does not cut it. And, for the record, I have seen worse films than this, but the dialogue and storytelling, very clunky. And there's a lack of craftsmanship that does not help matters. Now, the makeup effects for the villain are pretty atrocious. In his defense, he does kind of look like Sting, the WWF wrestler, but it's a poor man's version. It really is. Even worse, the actor who plays the bad guy, he's no Robert Englund. That's for sure. His performance is pretty awful, just as bad as the makeup, if not worse. Very little talent on display here. But hey, he does have a glove at one point with blades for fingernails, so at least we get that. They got that part right. Pacing is an issue at times due to the lack of extended horror sequences, but in this one, the lighting at times is too dark. They don't really light the sets that well, and because of that, there's very little atmosphere to enjoy during the slower moments. Now, on the positive side, there are a few unintentionally hilarious moments, like when the villain near the end says, and I quote, "insignificant skill," when one of the heroes tries to take him down. That was pretty funny. And a few of the special effects are actually okay. It's only 77 minutes long, but it's not even really worth sitting through, in my opinion. I don't recommend this. I really don't. It is available, actually, on Tubi. Unbelievably, it's available on Tubi, but I would not even suggest watching it, alone. I would say, because it's so boring, I would tell you, watch my feature-length commentary instead. So I'll include a link, to that collab I did with the Artie Dans in the description box below. If you must watch it, do that. Then, we move on to Hong Kong, and we're going back in time to the 1980s. The next two films are from Hong Kong, and they're from the 1980s. And I hadn't seen these when I covered the 1980s on this horror playlist before. So, I've holes I'm filling in as well, you know what I mean? And this one, or actually both of the next two films, star Kent Cheng, who you'll probably notice when you see him. So the first one here is called The Trail from 1983. Again, this is from Hong Kong. The following plot synopsis was taken from the website Eastern Kicks. The plot begins as a young man is murdered whilst trying to protect his wife from the advances of a sleazy landlord, being drowned for his troubles. Trying to cover up his crime, the killer leaves the corpse with two priests, Captain, played by Kent Cheng, and his sidekick Ying, played by Ricky Hui, who guide the recently dead to their places of rest in the finest hopping corpse style. That's a little bit misleading. Their bumbling results in the corpse being lost in the depths of a swamp. However, it soon arises as a vengeful zombie who sets about murdering the smugglers and all who cross its vengeful path, leaving it up to the rascally priests to try to stop its rampage. Now, most notably, this was directed by Ronnie Yu, who would later direct The Bride with White Hair, among a bunch of other films. And as you might expect, this film has some visual flair to it, alright? Gets some nice lanterns that glow in the dark at times. The forest is pretty spooky. You get sulfur pits, hanging vines, foggy pathways. Quite a bit of fog in this film. There's stony caves that are explored as well. And consequently, quite a bit of atmosphere, which is, if you haven't guessed, is quite important for me. Now, the music adds to the spookiness. They use animal sounds a lot, too. Now, early on, we have a group of protagonists who travel together with the corpses to kind of transport them. But after the monster emerges, they team up again and go on another excursion to stop the terror, once and for all. Now, the villain in this is more of like a humanoid monster with slimy skin that bleeds green blood. So when they say hopping vampire in the plot synopsis, you don't really get that here, all right? You don't even see the monster that much because it's usually shown through like shadows on the walls and stuff, or from a distance, or perhaps only certain body parts, you know what I mean, like his feet or hands. It's a big and slow monster, but very strong. So if he gets a hold of you, you're probably dead. This is not an action hybrid either. And I know a lot of these Hong Kong flicks from the 80s, you think like horror, thriller, action. They do a lot of genre benders during the 80s especially, and early 90s. So you don't really get much action in this, all right? This is really kind of safely classified as a horror film, a period piece as well. Now, there is a sprinkling of comedy, but it's not overly goofy or wacky, but there are a few moments here and there, like the bathtub scene is pretty funny, and another scene that made me laugh is when the protagonist attempts to make toad sounds, but overall, this movie does take itself pretty seriously, and I did enjoy it, so I do recommend The Trail if you have not seen it. Now, this is available on Region 3 DVD. I think I bought it off of the DDD House website. Some of these are a little difficult to find streaming tonight, just so you know. All right, so we stay in Hong Kong for the next one. And the next one is good. It's another good one. Vampire's Breakfast from 1987. A newspaper reporter stumbles upon a nest of vampires living in contemporary Hong Kong. Fat Pow, played by Kent Cheng, is suspicious of a murder case. He finds Angie Lin, played by Emily Chu, who witnessed a non-human creature at the scene. In contacting her for information, he falls in love with her. Meanwhile, another witness emerges and confirms that the distinct tooth holes on the neck of the victims point to the murderer being a vampire. Now, this film is set in urban locales, which is very different from most Hong Kong vampire movies, which tend to be period pieces. And this neat setting helps to change things up for the subgenre, especially if you're like marathoning these movies over a period of time. This is a good one to mix in because it has a little different flavor because of the contemporary urban environment that they use. There are some nice like stone buildings and stuff that are showcased during the middle section as well. Some pretty nice lighting during the night scenes. The score and music are relatively creepy as well. There is an investigation element here in between the scares with our reporter protagonist, asking questions, attempting to figure out if a vampire is really the cause for this murder spree. Now, the vampire stuff itself is not your typical Hong Kong hopping variety, all right? You could tell early on this thing has, like, blonde hair. I think it might be like a European vampire or something. And later on, you see his eyes are white and his skin is like a nasty grayish, like, blue. He also wears, like, a black suit as well. So it's very interesting vampire design, I think. Now, so you have the different time period here for a Hong Kong vampire movie, and you have a different vampire design, which gives it a little bit of a, like I said, a different feel. But the vampire is tough to take down. Difficult to catch him or defeat him in combat, which is nice. So there are multiple, like, confrontations throughout the film. Now, early on, we get a vampire attack in the backseat of a car, and then we do get an action set piece in this one. This one does have a little bit more of an action vibe to it. Inside of, like, a blood bank facility, where the vampire showcases its incredible strength, fighting off multiple protagonists. It's a good scene. There are a few scenes of suspense, like one inside of a mall, and then we get a two-phase finale. A throwdown in a decrepit building, and then a confrontation on the rooftop of an apartment complex. So, this movie, it kind of covers multiple bases in multiple genres, which is nice. Best line of dialogue in the film, I'm going to give it to you. Your coverage of blood-sucking is beguiling. And it's, one of the newspaper guys getting criticized for how he covers vampire stuff in his newspaper. That's a great line. But I think this movie satisfies. It's a fun flick. I do recommend Vampire's Breakfast. It is currently available on Region 3 DVD again. And again, I think I bought this one on DDD House. Alright, now we travel to Japan for our next handful of titles here. The next film is one of those, like, micro-budget, and I'm talking micro-budget, gore flicks that were rather common on the Japanese video market during the 1990s. And that is called Women's Flesh, My Red Guts, 1999. Japan coming correct with this one. No, not quite. But a woman is abandoned by her husband, so she copes with her grief through violence. As she holds a toothbrush, she decides to use it in a violent, sexual way to release her tensions. And as she inflicts horrific pain and mutilation upon herself, she hopes to relieve the flood of negative emotions. But the more she harms herself, the more she wants to cause even more damage, soon covered in blood and barely alive. Alright. Sounds pretty nasty. And, this is from the director of Psycho the Snuff Reels, yes. Also known as Tumbling Doll of Flesh, which was released 1 year prior in 1998. And I covered that film. Not the biggest fan of that one. Did not like that movie for a variety of reasons that I covered previously in this playlist. But Women's Flesh, My Red Guts, despite having kind of a metal title, it's pretty metal, it does have like a similar snuff film vibe to it. But is it any better? Not really. I think it's in that same category as Tumbling Doll of Flesh. Now, first of all, this is not exactly the poster child for script writing, as you might expect. We get one extremely short scene of her boyfriend breaking up with her, I think. And it went in a fairly respectful manner. It's not like he did anything really bad to the girl that could set her off edge, And that's it. That's basically all the character development you get. Tumbling Doll of Flesh had more plot than this, and that's saying something. Now, I do have to give My Red Guts some credit. This movie is pretty disgusting. And our protagonist cuts off parts of her body, cuts herself open, and the more extreme stuff does happen near the end, and it could give you an upset stomach. But those scenes only elicit emotions of disgust, not fear or terror, The scene with the toothbrush looks like it was actually performed, if you get my drift. She actually put it in there. There was some pixelation, of course, but good on her for method acting, I suppose. But like I said, this is extremely low budget. It severely limits its sets and locales. Almost the entire film takes place in a bathroom. So it does become boring. It does. Some scenes feel drawn out, despite the very short runtime of 42 minutes. So, to this film's credit, if someone found it on a bootleg tape or on the internet, they might think it's actually real for a portion of its runtime. But it's not a good movie. Don't even bother. Unless you're really into, like, the Japanese micro-budget fake snuff film scene from the 90s. You check it out, I guess, but otherwise, don't even bother. It is available on DVD, unbelievably. It is. Alright, next. This one's a pretty big one here. And that is called Tokyo, The Last War. So we go back to Japan for a film from 1989. And this is a fantasy horror drama. So the year is 1945. After the horrific fire bombings of the Pacific War levels Japan to the ground, the government decides to consult spiritual psychics to aid them in winning the war. Unfortunately, the resentment and agony of the souls of the firebombing victims culminate together to revive the evil Onmyoji Yasunori Kato. Only a young, psychically imbued apprentice of the priests will dare fight against the evil magic user. However, can this lone man possibly contend with Kato's overwhelming power? Now, I do have a full-length review of this one on my channel, and it is a sequel to Tokyo the Last Megalopolis, which is a very cool movie that was directed by Akio Jisoji. Now, this installment was directed by Takashige Ichise, who is a big-time producer of Japanese horror movies, and the assistant director of this film is Nagai Choi Lam, who famously directed the Hong Kong movie Ricky-O, Story of Ricky. So you're getting some collaboration here on the directing side that's kind of nuts. Masaya Kato plays our lead protagonist, and Kyusaku Shimada returns as the evil Kato. Kaho Minami from Angel Dust is the female lead, and Tetsuro Tamba, who's a very popular actor, has a supporting role. So there's a lot of talent in this movie, both behind and in front of the camera. Now the pacing in this one, kind of like the original film, The Last Megalopolis, is on the slower side. The story covers less ground and time when compared to The Last Megalopolis. It does drag a little bit, I think. But the continued infusion of fantasy horror into World War II era continues to make this particular franchise memorable and unique. And this combination is not something we see that often. So it becomes kind of a refreshing and fascinating experience while you're watching it. Performances and direction are good. I mean, it's, you think that would be obvious given the talent, and yes, it is. I mean, that's all that really needs to be said about it. Now, near the midpoint, we get some surprisingly bloody death scenes. There's a really freaky scene in a hospital that includes what is probably the most memorable shot of the entire film. And the wire work for the villains flying is quite good as well. I would say if I were to compare it to The Last Megalopolis, I probably prefer Last Megalopolis a little bit more, because I feel like the pacing was a little bit more consistent in that one. But this sequel is worth watching, especially if you enjoyed Megalopolis. And again, I do have full-length reviews of both films on this channel if you need a bit more detail, but I do recommend this one. It's a pretty cool flick. Now, Tokyo The Last War is available on YouTube with subtitles. Alright, now we're going to go to our second rewatch of the evening. Alright, we stay in Japan for this one. And this is one that I've seen a few times before. And again, kind of like the Unborn, I just thought it was okay, or decent. But on my recent rewatch, I actually enjoyed it a little bit more. So this is another film that I'm officially classifying as like a recommendable film. And that is Mikadroid, Robokill Beneath Disco Club Layla, 1991, from Japan. So during World War II, the Japanese military established a secret underground laboratory in Tokyo. 3 Olympic-level athletes were selected to undergo a process that would turn them into Jinrago, superhuman armored soldiers. By March 1945, one of the soldiers had been completely transformed into the half-man, half-machine ultimate soldier called Mikadroid. But American B-29s firebombed the city. 45 years passed, Tokyo is rebuilt, but old secrets are forgotten. The site is now home to a complex that includes the disco club Layla, and the disco's patrons dance late into the night, unaware that a faulty basement generator has reactivated Mikadroid, and the cyborg now prowls the basement levels, killing anyone in its path. Premise of this film is frickin' awesome, right? I mean, an awesome premise. I would say the execution is merely good, though. It's merely good. It's not as crazy or as insanely fun as it probably could have been. Yoriko Doguchi stars and is very easy on the eyes. I've always been a fan of this actress. She appeared in a handful of Kiyoshi Kurosawa films, most notably. She has a very, classy, cosmopolitan look to her in this film. She does a good job of acting scared, and she also leans into the black humor aspect of the film by mugging for the camera and intentionally overacting in certain spots. So, I liked her. Her character probably could have been annoying if you go in expecting a completely serious horror film, but there is a lot of black humor here, and I think she played it right. Now, the film mostly takes place over the course of one night. It has that old school Japanese dance club vibe from the late 80s, early 90s, and some of the underground sets are pretty cool. Now, the robot design in this, kind of weird. I mean, they obviously tried to give it a 1940s look, which makes sense given the plot and the fact that it was constructed in the 40s, but I thought that the color scheme was a little monotone. The robot looks a little bit bland, I think. But, thankfully, the robot itself is mostly efficient in its termination of its victims. The body count in this film is actually pretty respectable. A few of the death scenes are really funny, as they completely abandon any sense of realism, as the victims act in excessively artificial ways while meeting their demise, or even after they're dead. And I'm not going to give you specifics, but it's pretty fun. And you could tell once the first few death scenes happen, you're like, okay, they're infusing some black humor into this pretty intentionally. So I did like that aspect to it. Some of the death scenes are bloody, but not especially gory or, like, disturbing. Certainly, this is a film that's very watchable at only 73 minutes long. Yeah, sure, you could say that there are a few moments during the middle section where the pacing slows down a notch, but, I mean, it's good stuff. I think it's a relatively unknown Japanese slasher, and it's pretty good. I do think it's pretty good. Like I said, the thing that really holds this back from being, like, an awesome movie, I think I would have liked a better robot design and maybe slightly brisker pacing, you know what I mean, and more outrageousness maybe, but I like this now, and I can see myself rewatching it on occasion. So this is available on YouTube with subtitles, so we're more fortunate on the last few in terms of availability. Alright, we got 3 left, and they're quite different. Alright, now we stay in Japan again, and this will be the final Japanese film we will be reviewing tonight. And this is one I've never heard of before, and it has a very weird production history. But it delivers, and that is Bloody Muscle Bodybuilder in Hell from 1995, kind of. We'll get to that in a minute. A Japanese horror comedy, I guess you could call it. The film begins with a psycho woman attacking a dude in the 1970s, but he defends himself and murders her, burying her under his tatami mat. Fast forward to the 1990s, where the man's adult son, a bodybuilder, agrees to meet a photojournalist ex-girlfriend to help her research on haunted houses. And accompanied by a psychic, they visit the abandoned house of his father. Now, trapped inside, he must save himself from a gruesome ghost hell-bent on revenge. Now, this movie it's been billed and marketed as the Japanese version of Evil Dead, is basically what it's marketed as. And there are certain similarities to it. But it does have an interesting production history. Morbidlybeautiful.com, the website, gives some history here. They said, inspired by the Evil Dead films, Shinichi Fukazawa started writing Bloody Muscle Bodybuilder in Hell on New Year's Day in 1995 and began production soon after. Shinichi shot 10 hours of footage over the next 10 years using 8mm film. And he didn't start editing the film until 2005. But due to several issues in post-production, it took another 4 years before the film was finally completed in 2009. So, technically this is a 2009 movie, but judging by the footage that I saw in the movie, most of it seemed to have been shot in 1995 or in that era. So I'm considering it like a 90s film, really. Now, this is extremely low budget, just like Dead Space, right? But, and it's student film level, all right? But this one is good. You do get some limitations, like most outdoor shots are in broad daylight. You have basic lighting used for the indoor shots. They use maybe a little bit of filtering at times, like yellow filtering for the day scenes, which I like to a certain extent. But, the production value here is not exactly huge. But there is a bit of atmosphere earned through the music, which is, I think, legitimately good. I'm not sure if they ripped it off from another movie that I can't remember, or if they actually, created it themselves. But it has like this creepy synthesizer vibe. And it's mostly like deep, spooky electronic ambient music. Almost relaxing to an extent. But the music is definitely a production highlight, especially if they, sourced it themselves or made it themselves. Now, the runtime of this, again, we have a few short runtime films tonight. This one's only 63 minutes long, and the pacing is good. I'd say the opening 20 minutes are the only part of the film that's a little bit slow as it sets things up, but the remaining 43 minutes is basically one long slugfest to the death in this house. And the ghost possesses a person who attacks our protagonist, and, things go from there. Now, the horror in this film has some charm. You could tell they put some effort into this. We get some fun, like, C-grade gore and a good amount of blood in this. There's a good amount of blood. Some creativity on display, some little moments that will surprise you, which I will not spoil. I would assume that the filmmakers had a good time making this film. It just feels like, hey man, let's try this effect, let's do this, let's do that, you know what I mean? And yeah, it's just a lot of like fun little moments in this. And I would say the final 15 minutes are pretty nuts. It does have a claustrophobic feel due to the small house, and they do have a lot of close-up camera shots they mix in as well, which is not my preference in terms of camera work, but it works fine here. Some of the makeup effects are freaking hilarious. I laughed out loud multiple points in this film. I mean, you can tell they put effort into it, but it still looks like weird, you know? And there are some very specific direct references to Sam Raimi's Evil Dead movies, but also some general similarities as well. So I recommend this. I think it's a pretty neat little homage to Evil Dead, or I guess you could call it a ripoff. I don't know if they got the rights to do it. But yeah, this is a deep cut here that never even heard of it before until it was released just fairly recently on Blu-ray and DVD. And it's also on Tubi for free. So if you want to stream it, check it out. I like this movie. I think it's pretty fun. All right, 2 more films left, folks. We got 2 left. One of them is pretty good. The other one, not so much. And we jump back to Hong Kong for these, all right? The first one is called Erotic Nightmare from 1999. This is an exploitation drama horror flick from Hong Kong. A guy meets a sorcerer who promises to give him erotic dreams, but the dreams come with a price that's more than money. Our protagonist, played by Anthony Wong, is a businessman, but he has erotic dreams, and his sex life with his wife has stalled out due to her health problems. So he eventually becomes addicted to the dream and falls in love with a beautiful female student inside of it. Unfortunately, the dream is part of the monk's conspiracy to obtain or destroy all that matters to our protagonist. So the premise, you know, for an exploitation flick could be pretty cool. It's not. Alright. The opening scene of this movie in a hospital makes it seem like it might be very trashy. Right out of the gate, like we have an exploitation feel with an oral sex scene that's played for laughs, but it's not funny at all. It's like really a bad attempt at humor. Really bad. It might actually turn off some viewers just from continuing the movie from there, and to be honest, I couldn't blame you. And you're not missing much. Because Erotic Nightmare, despite having a lot of nudity as well as some sex scenes, it's too drawn out and repetitive. And I'm just talking all negative so far here, alright? It's not as much fun as what an exploitation should be. You know, like, we look at tons of sleazy Hong Kong and Japanese movies on this YouTube channel, many of which are pretty entertaining, if you're not, you know, easily offended. But this one in particular just feels like, it just feels like a westernized soft core movie, really. It's really lacking in that Hong Kong pizzazz and energy and nuttiness and insanity that could kind of take a movie like this and really elevate it. It just doesn't have that feel. It just feels flat when you watch it. And then it tries to do like some serious drama as well, which is a huge mistake. And it just makes the movie boring to watch. Now, one positive that I would like to mention is that there is an unexpected moment in the film that I did enjoy. But even as a horror film, you know, I classify it, what did I say it was? I said it was a drama horror hybrid, and that's really what it is. There's like not a lot of horror until like the midpoint, and then there's some bloody violence during the second half, but it's not really noteworthy. There were a few scenes that I chuckled a little bit, but the humor, it's not enough, folks. Not enough. So I did not like Erotic Nightmare, despite Anthony Wong being in it. So I don't recommend it. It's currently available, though, on a Blu-ray box set called Made in Hong Kong Volume 1 from Vinegar Syndrome. So, hey, you know, if you really want to check it out, I guess it's there for you. And now our final film of the evening. all right? And that is Centipede Horror, 1982, from Hong Kong. Now, what should have been a seal of protection turns into a gateway for hordes of flesh-eating centipedes when Y gives a mysterious family necklace to his sister to keep her safe while traveling in Southeast Asia. By chance, this very heirloom catches the eye of a malicious street food peddler who targets the family with all of the fury in his soul. So the movie opens with images of creepy, crawly centipedes. Yeah, it's an insect horror film, folks. They're inching their way across different surfaces. And that's emphasized with multiple freeze frames of these little critters. And we do get some actual centipede attacks, of course. This is not an insanely violent movie. There is some macabre imagery, like the victims look like they're suffering from Ebola or something, you know? And when they die, sometimes centipedes will like emerge from their lesions of their bodies and stuff. So there is a little bit of like gore, but it's not too crazy. Now, as you would expect from a Hong Kong horror movie from the 1980s, there's a good amount of spellcasting and wizardry to supplement the centipede attacks, which is cool. My biggest problem with the film is the pacing. It does have a few slow patches, but, like the opening half is a lot of family investigation and dialogue. But I do enjoy Centipede Horror. I think it's a good flick. I actually have a full-length review on my channel if you want, all the, the details as to why I like it. But I think it's just it's one of those Hong Kong flicks from back in the day that's like animal exploitation films, you know what I mean? And I talk about that in my full-length review. But this one, I think, delivers pretty well, and it's entertaining enough. So I do recommend it. Now, that concludes... Oh, wait. I gotta give you the availability. It's on Daily Motion. It did have a Blu-ray release from Error 4444, but that's out of print. I'm pretty sure I mentioned this when I did my full-length review of this, that it had an Error 4444 release. But it's tough to find now on that Blu-ray, but you can find it on Daily Motion. It's worth watching. So this concludes my Asian horror addendum. All right, this one. So we covered, mostly Hong Kong and Japanese stuff, mixing in, Thailand and mainland China here and there. So, nice mix here. We got some that I would never recommend. But we have a pretty cool selection of films to catch up on if you haven't seen them yet. And, if you've seen any of these, let me know your thoughts. And as always, folks, I'll see you next time.